A young traveller's worst nightmare. Miles from home, no one knows where they are. The victims came from all over the world.
These people were just vanishing off the face of the earth. We had no record, nobody noticed.
7 young backpackers were killed in 2.5 years.
I've got no doubt that he would kill again.
They had little chance of escape.
The isolation of this place is terrifying.
It was one of the biggest murder investigations in Australian history, and the police didn't even know if they were looking for one killer or 2.
I was of the view that the facts suggested 2 people rather than 1.
Get out on the ground!
This is the inside story of the investigation that shocked the world. The hunt for Australia's most notorious killer. In the autumn of 1992, Australian police launched an investigation into the deaths of 4 backpackers found murdered in the Milat State Forest just 2 hours from Sydney. The victims had been sexually assaulted before being shot or stabbed in frenzied attacks. Despite similarities between the murders, police denied a serial killer was on the loose. But when the body count began to rise, the search for the backpacker killer became the biggest manhunt in Australian history. Sydney, Australia. Nearly 100,000 backpackers flock to the country every year. They stay for weeks or months, most following the well-travelled East Coast routes. They start in Sydney, and when they tire of the big city and the surf, they head north towards Cairns or south to Melbourne.
We get backpackers from all over the world, all different nationalities, and they seem to link up with each other, and then they go off travelling. They just get up from where they were and take off.
Backpackers are drawn to the buzz of the cities and to Australia's vast, untouched wilderness. Some prefer hitchhiking to get around. It's cheaper, and they meet real Australians, but it isn't recommended.
Hitchhiking is a risk, a big risk, especially here in Australia, as your distances between A and B are so far, and that means that they are a long time on the road. And hitchhiking, they may be picked up by 3 or 4 different motorists or truck drivers before they reach their destination.
By 1992, not many people hitchhiked. Over a dozen young Australians and tourists had vanished from the highways. No one knew what had happened to them. In September of that year, 2 runners were training in Milat State Forest. A few meters from the track, they discovered a body. 30 meters away, another corpse was found. When police arrived at the scene, they were shocked at what they saw.
The excessive violence being used was horrifying, like what must have went through those kids' mind before they were actually slain.
The Missing Persons Inquiry had gathered dental records of backpackers who had disappeared. 2 records matched the bodies. They were 21-year-old Caroline Clark and 22-year-old Joanne Walters. 2 British backpackers reported missing 5 months earlier. Joanne trained as a nanny and looked after children in Sydney for a couple of months. Joanne met Caroline in a backpackers' hostel in Sydney. The pair decided to team up and go fruit picking. to help pay their way around Australia. When they hadn't heard from her for over a month, Joanne's parents came to Australia to look for their daughter.
If Joanne hadn't been the person who rang us regularly, we wouldn't have been so worried. But after 2 weeks, we started to get worried straight away. And we knew that Joanne was not a person who wouldn't find some way of getting in touch with us. And I know she wasn't the type to, she would have known we worried so much.
In April 1992, Caroline and Joanne had left Sydney looking for a lift to Melbourne.
G'day, girls. How you going? Need a lift?
Their families never heard from them again. Caroline was shot in the head 10 times. The police thought she'd been used as target practice. There were groups of wounds on the back of her head and on either side. Joanne died very differently. Holes in her shirt showed 14 stab wounds. She'd been stabbed 4 times in the chest, once in the neck, and 9 times in the back. The stab wounds to her spine would have paralysed her. Joanne's parents visited the scene of the crime.
They came down to the forest and I took them into the forest to do the scene. And it's one of the most traumatic experiences, you know, any police officer wants to do, or had to do, because they were visibly, you know, absolutely shattered, standing there at the scene where their daughters had been taken away from them.
They faced the cameras to appeal for information.
We feel that somebody out there might feel that there's something that's not important, but everything at this stage is important.
And all I want to say is that these people who have done these to these girls, that they are just proper animals and they ought to be shot.
But the police had little to go on. They turned to a forensic psychiatrist. He analysed the crime to suggest the kind of killer they were looking for. The forest gave him something to work on.
It was the kind of area that one would expect the macho kind of person who committed these crimes to frequent. Fairly rough sort of country, rough scrub, difficult to find your way around in. I thought, when I looked at it, that it was someone who'd been there before and who knew it. The offender would engage in hunting, might have previous history of that, of offences of some kind.
The difference in the way the girls had been murdered made Dr. Milton think that there were 2 killers.
It suggested that one liked personal violence, close personal violence, and got some satisfaction from that. And it suggested that the other one liked violence at a distance, that is, exercising power in a more remote sort of way without making contact with the victim.
To move the case forward, the police re-examined the physical evidence. 10 bullets had been recovered from Caroline Clark's skull and the surrounding soil, and 10 Winchester cartridges were found just a few meters from her body. They called in a ballistics expert to try to identify what kind of gun had been used.
By examining the various marks on the bullets and the cartridge cases, the size of the marks, their relationship to each other and so on, we can then refer to a manufacturer's specification list, which gives us an idea of what type of firearm was possibly used. And after doing a lot of research in this area, I was quite happy that the only gun that I was aware of that could have left these marks was a Ruger Model 1022, which is a 22 caliber rifle with a self-loading or semi-automatic action.
Knowing that the killer used a Ruger rifle was of limited help. There were 55,000 of them in Australia.
We weren't aware of exactly where all these rifles were. I mean, you can check with firearms dealers and who they sold this particular model through, etc. But that really massive job, and it was like searching for a needle in a haystack.
The police found no other evidence where the bodies had been discovered.
As the months went by and the investigators sort of went down chasing various leads, ultimately what happened was that these exhibits were filed in what we called our unsolved crime drawer, and I was sure that this was going to be yet another double unsolved murder.
No one realised that Caroline and Joanne were just the latest victims of a serial killer. A year later, the police were no closer to solving their murders. Bruce Pryor lived near Belanglo Forest. He often went there to collect firewood and knew it well. He remembered the story of the murdered British girls in the news.
My interest is pricked by that to start with, and over the next sort of 3 or 4 weeks, you know, I'm sort of starting to think, well, you know, there's very little more mention of it, and what's happening from then on, it sort of progressed from there.
The story may have disappeared from the headlines, but Pryor couldn't get it out of his mind. He was sure the answer was still in Belanglo and decided to start his own search.
I'd become a little bit obsessed with thinking I might find some evidence relating to the Clark and Walters murders.
Pryor searched thousands of square metres of the forest, going to Belanglo every week for 9 months. What he found one day in October 1993 was to shock Australia.
At one point, forced my way through a bit of scrub and looked down on the ground, and there's a human skull upside down on the ground.
Unknown to Bruce Pryor, 22 metres away, lay another skeleton. Belanglo was a killing ground. In 1992, the bodies of 2 young backpackers were found in the Belanglo State Forest just outside of Sydney. When a 3rd victim was discovered just a year later, Australian police put a task force together to investigate the murders and search for more bodies.
I did wonder how many more bodies we would find, and it was several weeks before I had any confidence that we knew that answer.
It was Australia's biggest ever search team, over 300 officers, but it was tiny compared to the vast scale of Belanglo State Forest. It stretches for almost 40 square kilometres. Inspector Bob May was in charge of the operation.
The bodies that were located were within 50 or 60 metres of a dirt track. So based on that, that's what caused our search to continue along those lines. If we went 30, 40, 50 metres in with 20 police on the line, depending on the country and the tracks in the area, that we hoped we'd find, if there were more bodies, we'd hope we'd find them.
The bodies were identified by dental records. Deborah Everest and James Gibson both grew up in Melbourne, but hadn't known each other long. In December 1989, they'd been in Sydney during their summer holidays. They'd planned to hitch to a festival. James's mother had been worried about them hitchhiking. He said they'd be safe because they were travelling together. They'd been missing for 4 years. James Gibson's skeleton was marked with 8 stab wounds. A large knife had cut through his upper spine, causing paralysis. Stab wounds to his back and chest would have punctured his heart and lungs. Deborah Everest had been savagely beaten, her skull fractured in 2 places, her jaw broken. There were knife marks on her forehead, and she'd been stabbed once in the back. The bodies had lain just 600 metres from where Caroline and Joanne had been discovered a year before. Police turned their attention to the man who had stumbled across the latest find.
I was expecting, you know, a little pat on the back and, you know, job well done, and suddenly I'm treated as a suspect, and I found that very hard to deal with.
While the police kept an eye on Bruce Pryor, they were given an unexpected clue. A man called Alex Milat told police he and a friend had seen two girls being abducted.
Some months ago, they had been in the Belanglo forest. They had seen this car with a number of youths in it, and they had a couple of people in the back who looked as they were tied up and were women. Now, it was a very strange story. We did check the story and followed it through, and as I said, we're just not sure why they came forward with that story. It was also unusual that you'd see a person saying that I thought these people were abducted in a car. They were being driven into the forest, but I don't know. I didn't bother reporting it or telling anyone.
The statement didn't ring true, but it raised suspicions about Alex Milat. Detectives started investigating. Immediately striking about him was the size of the family he came from. There were 14 siblings. Alex Milat was the eldest of 10 brothers. The family had grown up 100 kilometres from Belanglo Forest. They were known to be a tight-knit group with a tough reputation.
Most of the boys had been in and out juvenile detention centres and jails. If one of them was caught, they'd take the full brunt of the law, whereas the others would get away with it. So they were as thick as thieves, you could basically say, that they actually stuck together.
The Milat family were now what the police called persons of interest, but they weren't yet suspects for the 4 murders. The police were still searching for evidence in the forest. They didn't realise they hadn't finished finding bodies.
We came in 30, 40 metres this way, and the line started to head east. I was at the front of the line. I just had a feeling, because of the lay of the land and the roads in and the clearings and everything, this was a similar type of area that the other bodies were located. So I asked the troops to just stop and concentrate, and as I was actually speaking to him, they called me to the end of the line and located a skeleton of Simone Smittle just about where we are now. And she was covered up with branches, and all you could see was a boot. That was it.
21-year-old Simone Schmittel from Germany had been in Australia for 4 months before she vanished. She had hitched to Melbourne once already and thought it was safe. Unlike the other victims, Simone was alone when she was abducted. She was driven for half an hour deep into the forest. She would have known there was no escape. The murder of Simone Schmittel was particularly brutal. The 21-year-old had been bound and gagged before being stabbed at least 8 times. 2 wounds had severed her spine, leaving her helpless. Others had punctured her heart and lungs. The body count in the forest had reached 5. Two days later, the body count went up again. Clive Small announced what everyone had known for weeks.
I think it's fair to say that given that we now have 7 bodies recovered, and notwithstanding that we don't know the cause of death in the present case, that we do have a serial killer.
The news of 2 more bodies went global. The murderer had earned a name, the backpacker killer. His victims were from 3 countries. The police hoped the media profile would give them a lucky break.
Die australische Polizei hat in einem Waldgebiet bei Sydney.
Police in Australia have stepped up the hunt for a serial killer.
From the very outset, we were hopeful that there were people who had got away from the offender or offenders, and that was one of the reasons we paid so much attention to the media coverage both in Australia and overseas.
British tourist Paul Onions thought he was worldly wise enough to spot any danger. At 26, he was older than most backpackers. He got to Liverpool, on the outskirts of Sydney, and planned to hitchhike 1,000 kilometres to Melbourne on the Hume Highway. He'd already been trying for an hour without success and was on the point of giving up.
G'day, mate. How you going?
Good, thanks.
Waiting for a lift?
Yeah, mate, I'm going to Melbourne.
Well, it's your lucky day. I'm heading that way. That's my 4-wheel drive. Throw your stuff in.
Paul thought he'd finally struck lucky. It would take 14 hours to drive all the way to Melbourne. The journey began with small talk.
So where are you from?
I'm from Birmingham, in the UK.
What do you think of Australia so far?
Yeah, it's pretty good, yeah. Enjoying the weather.
I'm going to pull up when we get further up the road. We'll lose the radio signal when we get this far out of Sydney. I'll grab some tapes from the back so we can listen to some music, eh? I'm just going to get those tapes. Where are you going?
Just going to get some air.
We'll stay in the car. It'll only be a minute. You know what this is? Get back in the car!
A passing motorist saved Paul's life by picking him up. 4 years after surviving his ordeal, Paul Onions read about the case in a British newspaper. The bodies had been found close to where he was attacked. Paul phoned the Australian hotline, describing his assailant.
Murders? Oh, yeah, I'd like to make a statement.
It could have been a major breakthrough, but his statement was lost among the 5,000 calls made to the hotline in its first 24 hours.
Thanks, bye.
No one called Paul back, and the backpacker killer was no closer to being caught. In November 1993, the remains of 2 more backpackers were discovered in the Belanglo State Forest near Sydney. With the death toll reaching 7, police now knew they were hunting a serial killer. The latest discoveries were shocking. The violence had reached a new level. "20-year-old Anya Habshid had finished her studies and wanted to travel. She and her boyfriend, 21-year-old Gabor Neugebauer, left Germany in October 1991 to travel around Indonesia. Going to Australia was a spur-of-the-moment decision. They were due home in late January 1992. Gabor was shot 6 times in the head. Anya had been decapitated. Her neck had been severed with 1 blow. Her head was never found. This time, police used an anthropologist to analyse the murders. Once again, the very different methods used to kill Gabor and Anya suggested that there was more than one killer.
Decapitation of Anya Habshid suggested to me the possibility, the likelihood of 2 perpetrators, because I could imagine a dominant individual, the dominant individual, simply taking her hair and cutting her head off and making some sort of laconic and ironic kind of comment to the effect of, well, that should shut her up. But also something which would be a statement of dominance over the other individual.
It appeared Gabor had been used as shooting practice, just like Caroline Clark, the British girl. There were 3 bullet holes in the left of his skull and 3 at the base. It looked like the same person was responsible, but investigators needed to prove the same gun had been used. By comparing marks on the bullets, ballistics experts could show whether one weapon had been used both times. But there was a problem.
Unfortunately, the examination of the bullets from his skull was very disappointing because the decomposition that had occurred from his rotting brain tissue had affected the surface of the bullets, and that had destroyed all of the the marks, the rifling marks and the individual marks that we rely upon, all I could tell investigators at that point in time was that a .22 calibre firearm had been used, but that was all. So that was quite disappointing.
But bullets aren't the only things ballistics experts can analyse. After the gun is fired, the empty cartridge case is ejected and it becomes scratched by the breech bolt when it leaves the gun.
Successive cartridges fired through that same gun will generally leave identifiable marks, and so the cartridge cases also provide a very good link back to the firearm responsible.
47 Winchester cartridge cases were found near Gabor Neugebauer's body.
When I microscopically compared those to the ones that were found near Carolyn Clark's body, I was able to establish through the chamber marks that they'd been fired in the same weapon. So now we had proof that the murder weapon had been used at 2 locations, and so that provided a definitive physical link.
Both murders had been carried out using one of the 55,000 Ruger 1022s in Australia. As detectives traced each one, it was brought to Sydney Police Centre for testing. Gerard Dutton needed to see what marks were left on the fired cartridge cases.
I was comparing them to the murder exhibits in order to see whether that gun was or was not responsible. Now, that sort of work is very much hit and miss. To come across the murder weapon by chance is a very long shot.
The exercise did have its benefits.
And in the process, over many, many months, I became very much aware of all of the features and the detail. It was like knowing the face of your own mother. You're that familiar that you'd recognise your mother anywhere. And so all of these marks on the cartridge cases and the bullets were the same. I knew if I came across the murder weapon and test-fired it, that I would recognise those marks instantly.
Testing every Australian Ruger would take months, and pressure was mounting on the police. It was clear that detectives needed a fresh lead, but they were swamped under 1.5 million pieces of information. They also faced the challenge of narrowing down a list of suspects that contained 2,000 names.
But many of the people we had nominated were nominated on the basis of they're suspicious, they've passed a comment or something, but there was nothing to really link them to the crime scene or to suggest that they were a genuine suspect for any real purpose.
It was the profiler's job to suggest what kind of person could be a genuine suspect. The forest gave them more clues. It reminded Dr. Basham of where he grew up in rural Georgia in the United States.
It really struck me as the sort of scenes that I'd seen as a kid growing up, you know, where you go into a certain area which had been used as a shooting gallery, and people had propped watermelons, or they had, taken trees and shot them, or even animals, in which animals had just been, subjected to just massive mutilation by bullet is simply part of target practice.
In parts of Georgia, Dr. Basham knew this kind of behaviour was often enjoyed by brothers who had had a close relationship over many years.
The solidarity, the kind of family society overrides the larger society. And I just had a feeling of the kinds of quality of the crime scenes that we might be dealing with that kind of family, that kind of person, a person raised in that kind of family.
Dr. Milton agreed. The killer may have grown up with guns and gone shooting with his family.
The family would be one which perhaps promoted violent acts or which didn't inhibit them, that there may have been other criminal behaviour in the family, that they may be in some ways isolated from other families because of those tendencies.
It was the kind of detailed analysis the police needed, and it reminded them of a family they had in their files. The Milat family were known to have firearms. Some of the brothers went shooting together. Some had criminal convictions.
That's exactly the sort of family I've been talking about. That's exactly the sort of environment, social environment that I would expect somebody who does this kind of thing to have grown up in.
With the profiler's opinions, the police had to ask the question, could the killer come from the Milat family? And if so, which brother was it? They took a closer look at their backgrounds. Some of the brothers didn't raise suspicions and had no criminal convictions, but some would definitely need investigating. Richard Milat was fond of guns and sometimes used an alias. Wally Milat had been in and out of prison, and Ivan Milat had convictions for theft and had faced an armed robbery charge. All the brothers were investigated. Ivan Milat was a road worker. It was a steady job he'd had for 16 years. He lived in Eaglevale, a suburb of southwest Sydney. It's suburbia, the gardens neat and tidy. Few of his neighbours knew that Ivan Milat spent most of the 60s in prison.
Hi, Ivan. Morning, love. How you going?
Good.
Good day for it, isn't it?
Yeah.
The police discovered Ivan loved guns and had a powerful four-wheel drive. He had sporadic relationships, including one with his brother's wife. And his ex-wife told police Ivan hadn't been as pleasant as his neighbours thought.
What's this garbage? What's this garbage? Don't touch it! Leave it alone! That was your fault! You don't touch it until I tell you different!
Although Ivan was known for keeping his house and garden neat and tidy, the smashed table was left on the floor for weeks.
The picture that emerged of Ivan was an absolute control freak. And even in his personal life, there were incidents where it was not what I would call normal behaviour. It was about absolute controlling behaviour.
It fitted very well with the profile of the first offender that I've described, that is, of someone who was employed, had a fast car, had a previous criminal record, but who liked violence in a very measured and sadistic fashion.
The case against Ivan Milat was getting stronger. In 1994, Australian police were hunting for the serial killer of 7 young hitchhikers. Their 2-year investigation had produced a prime suspect, road worker Ivan Milat, but they still needed hard evidence. Detectives decided to track down a vehicle Milat had once owned.
Excuse me, sir. Can I ask you some questions?
Yeah, of course.
Milat had sold it, but the new owner got more than he'd bargained for. He'd found a bullet under the front seat. The bullet was the same .22 caliber Winchester brand that had been used in the murders of Caroline Clark and Gabor Neugebauer. It didn't mean Ivan was the killer, and it didn't rule out one of his brothers. The police went to check out their alibis.
We looked at the dates on which all of these people disappeared and checked the movements of the Milat family through a variety of ways, including work and all of that. And Ivan was the only person who was unaccounted for on the day of each of the murders.
But there was still doubt. Nothing in Ivan's criminal record suggested he was capable of something as serious as the Belanglo killings. Investigators went through every detail again. Buried in a 23-year-old file, they discovered something that instantly made Ivan the prime suspect.
When we went through and checked the criminal history of the Milat family, what was filed on archive records, it wasn't readily available, we had to go back through hard copy searches, was the record that in about 1971, Ivan had been charged with abducting 2 women in the Bowral area and had been charged with raping them.
Ivan's defence had argued The girls had consented to sex. He wasn't convicted, but the case bore similarities to the murders. The girls had been picked up hitchhiking, and Ivan had driven them off down a dirt track.
The circumstances of the rape and abduction charge did give you a lot to think about when you compared it with what happened in the 80s and 90s and the murders that occurred in the Belanglo forest.
Ivan Milat was now the focus of the investigation. Every piece of information had to be checked again. Detectives went back to Alex Milat to talk to him and his wife about the statement he'd given them. They were stunned at what they were told.
It was quite unusual and strange because we had interviewed them several times. On this occasion, the investigators spent an hour or more, or a couple of hours with them, and were simply about to leave when Alex's wife, and then Alex, came out and said, "Oh, by the way, Ivan gave us this backpack."
The backpack belonged to Simone Schmittel, the killer's third victim. No one knows why Alex Milat told police about it.
It might well be that they just reached a point where they said, "We think Ivan did it and we should hand this over," whereas up to that point it might well have been they thought, no member of our family did this. We just don't know.
Then came the breakthrough the police had been waiting for. They discovered that someone the killer had attacked was still alive. 5 months after he'd called the hotline, Paul Union's statement was found. The police realised the attack on Paul fitted everything they knew about their suspect. Paul could be the only person able to identify the backpacker killer.
This is Paul. Well, the backpacker killers. I made a statement months ago.
We then had several contacts with him and arranged for British police to interview him. We were convinced that he was genuine, that he had quite a bit of detail to offer, and he was brought out to Australia, and he positively identified Ivan.
The net was closing in on Ivan Milat, but the police still couldn't be certain he was the killer, or if there was more than one. At 6:30 a.m. on the 22nd of May 1994, armed police surrounded Milat's Sydney home. They were to arrest him for the attack on Paul Onions. But they also hoped to prove that Milat was the backpacker killer.
We made the best judgment call we could at the time. Our view was that if nothing turned up, we would still be in a position to charge Ivan in relation to the abduction or shooting of Paul Onions. And from our point of view, that at least had him off the streets.
Hello?
Is Mr. Ivan Milat there?
He's not here.
Detective Sergeant Gordon's my name.
I want you to come outside for your safety.
And whoever's in the house with you.
Get out on the ground! Get down on the ground! Do it! Do it now!
With Milat under arrest, the search for evidence began.
We started finding property from the moment we opened the door to his house. To say we were surprised and somewhat stunned was to understate the situation. I certainly couldn't believe that we were finding the amount of property that we were finding.
They found Simone Schmittel's tent, Deborah Everest's sleeping bag, and more camping equipment in the garage. Milat was led away. The house was taken apart. They found firearms, ammunition, a large hunting knife, and a sword. Hidden inside a wall was a plastic bag. It was one of the most important finds.
When the bag was opened, I couldn't have been more excited. In that bag was a complete breech bolt assembly, a complete trigger assembly, and an aftermarket magazine for a Ruger 1022 rifle.
The breech bolt held the key to the murders of Gabor Neugebauer and Caroline Clark.
Knowing that the cartridge cases from the murder scenes contain some very good individual marks, that breech bolt was responsible for making those marks, and I was very keen to examine that and to determine if that indeed was a component from the murder gun.
Dutton fitted the breech bolt to a Ruger from the police firearms library. It was the moment he had been waiting for. Now he could compare the test-fired cartridges to those from the murder scenes.
I felt all the hairs on the back of my neck stand up on end. It was quite an extraordinary sensation because what I was looking at on these test-fired cases, those individual marks which I was so familiar with on the Clark murder cases, I was now seeing on my test-fired cases. And so even in a short space of time, I was quite happy that that component that we recovered from the wall cavity of Milat's house was fitted to the murder gun that was used to kill Clark.
The cartridge cases also matched those found near Gabor Neugebauer's body. In July 1996, Ivan Milat was convicted of the murder of all 7 backpackers. Police believe he killed many more.
There's no doubt in my mind that there are another 3 or 4 murders that he is responsible for. There are reasonable grounds to suspect that. There is certainly not enough evidence to prosecute him.
He has never confessed, and no one will ever know for sure why he killed.
I guess the only clue we've got really is that all these attacks appear to have occurred when he wasn't in a stable relationship. Now, by stable relationship, I mean a relationship where he was in control, and once he lost that control in a relationship, I would suggest that he tried to find that control through other means. And the other means were the abduction and killing of victims. I think the only good thing I can say about Ivan is that he will spend the rest of his life in jail and he'll die there.
But that left one final mystery. Did Ivan Milat operate alone, or was there a second killer?
It's still possible that they have one perpetrator, but it seems to me that in terms of the separation of the bodies, the differential nature of the injuries, it seemed to me somewhat more likely that it would be 2 perpetrators. We've got 2 personalities at work, 2 different people at work here.
Ivan's lawyers blamed his younger brothers, Wally and Richard, for the murders. The judge said he was certain that Ivan Milat did not act alone, but neither brother was ever charged. Police still insist there was only one backpacker killer. A young traveller's worst nightmare. Miles from home, no one knows where they are. The victims came from all over the world.
These people were just vanishing off the face of the earth. We had no record, nobody noticed.
7 young backpackers were killed in 2.5 years.
I've got no doubt that he would kill again.
They had little chance of escape.
The isolation of this place is terrifying.
It was one of the biggest murder investigations in Australian history, and the police didn't even know if they were looking for 1 killer or 2.
I was of the view that the facts suggested 2 people rather than 1.
Get out on the ground!
This is the inside story of the investigation that shocked the world. The hunt for Australia's most notorious killer. In the autumn of 1992, Australian police launched an investigation into the deaths of 4 backpackers found murdered in the Belanglo State Forest just 2 hours from Sydney. The victims had been sexually assaulted before being shot or stabbed in frenzied attacks. Despite similarities between the murders, police denied a serial killer was on the loose. But when the body count began to rise, the search for the backpacker killer became the biggest manhunt in Australian history. Sydney, Australia. Nearly 100,000 backpackers flock to the country every year. They stay for weeks or months, most following the well-travelled East Coast routes. They start in Sydney, and when they tire of the big city and the surf, they head north towards Cairns or south to Melbourne.
We get backpackers from all over the world, all different nationalities, and they seem to link up with each other, and then they go off travelling. They just get up from where they were and take off.
Backpackers are drawn to the buzz of the cities and to Australia's vast, untouched wilderness. Some prefer hitchhiking to get around. It's cheaper, and they meet real Australians, but it isn't recommended.
Hitchhiking is a risk, a big risk, especially here in Australia, as your distances between A and B are so far, and that means that they are a long time on the road. And hitchhiking, they may be picked up by 3 or 4 different motorists or truck drivers before they reach their destination.
By 1992, not many people hitchhiked. Over a dozen young Australians and tourists had vanished from the highways. No one knew what had happened to them. In September of that year, 2 runners were training in Belanglo State Forest. A few meters from the track, they discovered a body. 30 meters away, another corpse was found. When police arrived at the scene, they were shocked